about their research area. We might ask them to give a practice presentation, right? But that's a practice presentation of teaching to us. But we are gifted learners, right? I mean, we have proven that we have an ability to adapt to a variety of learning environments. We made it through, and we have advanced degrees and everything else. We haven't observed those people in the way that they teach to students who don't have that deep ability to learn. So if you're thrown into the classroom and you're already in the mode of learning as you go, low enrollment classes are much lower risk, right? In-person, face-to-face classes are much lower risk. Right, but a MOOC, right? I mean, as Steve was saying yesterday, right? You could be in the situation where when you make a mistake, you made a mistake in front of 100,000 people. That's a bit intimidating. So the criteria for instructional design, the first 5 come from the paper that's at the top there. These are focused on the learning activities that are available to students, so that they are problem-centered. That helps convince students that they're important. It's crucial to motivation that things be problem-centered. Activation, and that's not activation like active learning, which it may sound like. That's activation as in it activates prior knowledge, so it connects to what students already know. Demonstration, showing students how to do something, but then followed up by application, letting them practice doing it themselves, as Steve has been doing along the way with the edX system. And then finally, integration, which is reflection and discussion, an opportunity for students to challenge their knowledge by talking to other students and possibly being challenged by others. Those are the kinds of experiences, again, from a learning activity standpoint, that are likely to produce learning. But there are 5 more that were added by another paper that I cited earlier, and these are particularly relevant in the MOOC space, and we'll talk about why that is. These are learning resources. So these are things that are in place to support learning among the students. Collective knowledge. This is that learners contribute to the collective knowledge. So rather than just being taught to, bless you, rather than being taught to, they are co-constructors of a socially understood thing. Collaboration, that learners have a chance to collaborate with others, right, which has various motivations and learning benefits. Differentiation, that different learners receive instruction in different ways. And you can imagine, and again, we'll talk more about some of those. That you use authentic resources, so that the resources are real world, they're connected to the real world in some way. So that, again, it's motivating and it has better application. And then finally, that expert feedback is provided, which, as Steve mentioned, right, you plan for 15 hours a week of connecting with the discussion board to make sure that things haven't gone in a strange direction. It's fine if students are answering students' questions, as long as someone in the discussion really understands what is going on. But somewhere in that cycle, expert feedback has to be provided. Sometimes the expert feedback will be compliments to students who are long time and heavy posters, right? The people who are helping your learning community from inside the student cohort. And sometimes that expert feedback might be you or one of your teaching team to be able to set things back in the right direction. So MOOCs then are a designed thing. And when I talk to engineers, of course, that has some overtones, right? There are some things that means. And we've just talked about criteria for design. So there are frameworks for course and curricular design, fortunately, right? We don't have to do this all ourselves. So 2 methods follow. Both of these are considered by the MIT Teaching and Learning Laboratory. The first one is also used, is the one that we use in Purdue's engineering education course called Content, Assessment, and Pedagogy. Notice the name of that course, right? So content comes first. What is it that we want students to learn? Assessment, how will we know if they've learned it? And only then, pedagogy. What methods do we need to use to teach students to learn the things that we want them to learn and have those outcomes? So the first method is called backwards design. Now what I'm doing here, we don't have enough time, right, to practice and work in depth in any of the things I'm talking about. But what I want you to know is I'm trying to get you to if you are not familiar, to know the terminology, to know the places to look for the resources to think about the way you design a MOOC. So backwards design starts in the middle with what are the pivotal concepts and critical skills that I want students to know, and then working my way out with less intensity, right? So outside of that center zone are things that they're important for students to know and do, but they're not the ones that I would put maybe in the course description, or they're not the ones that if someone asks me what are the few things that a student learns in your course, they're not the things that would make my list. But I probably do those every year, right? Every time I teach the course. And the last one are things that it's worth being familiar with. Right, and that's probably the worth being familiar with is most of what I'm talking about today, right? Because you're not going to, any one of you is not going to attach to all of the things that I talk about today, but the idea is that some of it will resonate with you and you'll say, oh, that sounds like the way I want to approach this, and I will go and look up and find out more. So that's one approach, and Wiggins and McTighe are well known for this understanding by design, which talks about that approach. The other is by Biggs and Tang, and it's teaching for quality learning at university. And this one focuses on these three things, and the idea is that the three need to be aligned with one another. So one is the teacher's intention, right? Which, from your perspective, this is the most important thing, right? This is what you are trying to accomplish, the outcomes that you seek. But of course, the students also have intention. And so they may not be trying to learn what you're trying to learn, but at least you know what teaching and learning activities that you give them, and those need to align somewhat with the student's intention, or they simply won't do them. Right? All the time you provide learning experiences for students, and they don't capitalize on those experiences, and you may be frustrated by that, right? And the disconnect is if your learning activities don't match what their intentions are, they won't do them. And then finally...
May I just
yes.
make a comment on that one? I find that the students often do not know in the class what they expect from this class. Because I ask them, what are your expectations from a subject that's called strategic intent or whatever? You know?
Right.
And then they don't know.
Yeah, right. Their intent is to
so they
pass.
don't have an intent other than to pass.
Right. And so again, longitudinal research in the United States has been done where 40 years ago, if you asked a student for the number one reason why they went to college, that reason was to learn. Today, the number one reason a student goes to college is to get a degree. It's a very big difference, right? So now, in a space where those students are outcome oriented, but not focused on learning outcomes, but focused on certification, accreditation outcomes, it's up to us to make the connection between the two, right? To make the learning part of the process of getting the degree, because the students aren't making that connection for themselves.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great point. The third part of that triangle is assessment. How will learning be measured, right? And all of those three things need to be aligned. So when you assess things, you need to be assessing things that are important to you, but you need to assess them in a way that's aligned with students' intentions, or essentially you'll just end up measuring the wrong thing. So that's instructional design. So the interesting thing, let's talk. Since in that last slide, right, we started to talk about the students, right? We finally started talking about the students. So let's talk more about the students. So MOOCs were supposed to bring education to the masses, right? The target audience were the people that couldn't get to university, to prepare them to be able to come to university, or to learn without ever coming to the university. But they're not reaching that target audience. Here's the quote I promised you from the founder of Udacity, which, again, partnered with San Jose State, which is a school in the United States that has a fairly low socioeconomic base. And they were trying to do remedial math. And the quote was, students needing a remedial course were, quote, from difficult neighborhoods, without good access to computers, and with all kinds of challenges in their lives. It's a group for which this medium is not a good fit. How disappointing. That was the announcement that was made before Udacity left higher education and moved into a corporate market where they could make money. And they gave up on our students. But it's not over yet, right? So MIT Circuits and Electronics, which we've heard a lot about from Steve, right? So I have quite a bit of data about that one because it's been well studied. It had 230 million interactions. Now, an interaction could be between student and material or between student and student. And a much smaller fraction maybe student-instructor. But 230 million interactions. 13,000 discussion threads with 97,000 posts. And those include questions and answers and comments. Their participation had students from around the world. But here's where we start to get to narrowing that population, right? And you've heard, again, some of these numbers you've heard from Steve already. 70% of those were from high per capita income nations. So we weren't reaching the masses in that sense. 65% of the participants already had a bachelor's degree or higher. So we weren't reaching the masses in that sense. There were national differences in which materials were accessed, and that's an important one going forward as we think about what happens as a MOOC becomes a multinational learning experience. We'll talk more about that. There were 150, here's the other part, and again, you've heard from Steve, right? So 155,000 people registered for the course. 23,000 stayed until they actually attempted the first test. There were 9,000 left that actually passed the midterm, and then 7,000 passed the course, less than 5%. We're not reaching the masses. So part of the message there is, right, why? We need to think about why are we doing this and for whom. So if they're not reaching their intended audience, right, then part of the important part of this is to teach effectively, you need to know who the students are. So some of the ways we describe learners, right, are their level of education. I just talked about national culture, which again will come in, native language. But there are also a variety of taxonomies based on the ways that students interact with these courses. And they actually have quite a bit of overlap. So describing essentially how engaged students are. So students who sample, students who are disengaged completely, students who audit, and students who complete is one way they've been described. On the other hand, Enyon here describes it more in terms of the intended outcome of the student, back to the Biggs and Tang. So students who are approaching a MOOC from a just-in-time perspective. Now that's a career professional who needs a particular skill to be able to achieve some professional objective. And they're learning that material just in time for their own work. So they've been put on a project, they don't have all the right background, they come, they take a MOOC to learn a new skill so that they don't feel like they're an outsider. Just in case, people who are seeking some kind of professional development which will then position them better in their career in case they need to make a career shift, in case they're at risk of being laid off. Now, there are the lifelong learners. These are the people who we think of as more traditional students. They're seeking some kind of accreditation, some kind of certification that will advance their professional standing, because that's part of their career development. But they don't have a specific need in mind when they do it. And then finally, it's just access. It's people who just want to learn. They've never had the chance to learn. This has made the opportunity available to them, and so they just jump in to learn something for the love of learning, right? Yay, right? And all of those people have different drivers, they have different objectives, and they actually engage with the systems differently, so the materials that they actually engage are different based on which group they're in. And the last set of categories, again, it starts to sound similar, right? The bystander, the viewer, the collector, the all-rounder, and the solver, right? I mean, again, much of that is focused on the way that students engage with the course. So let's talk more about how students from different countries engage with materials. In the room, how do you learn to use a new piece of technology, in this case a cell phone? Which of these do you do? So how many people would contact the vendor and have them talk you through it? Not popular. How many people would imitate? So watch other people use the same piece of technology and then do it yourself. Okay? How many people would read the entire manual before beginning?
Unreadable.
Or the help file for it.
Or the help file for the software product. Not likely. How many folks would read a bit, try a bit, read a bit, try a bit, read a bit, try a bit? We're starting to get some more folks. How many people would just, if it's a piece of software, just turn it on and start using it? Right? If it's a cell phone, you just turn it on and start poking at buttons. Pretty popular around here. And how many people would just ask a friend, hey, how do you change the language settings on this phone?
Ask the kids.
Oh yeah, please, right, yeah, this technology is so easy, an 8-year-old could use it. Please, somebody find me an 8-year-old. Yeah.
There's another one. You go to YouTube.
Oh, well, yeah. Oh, I know.
They are not MOOCs.
I had to replace
stuff.
I had to replace the keyboard on my computer. I couldn't type the letter T anymore, which, by the way, is really annoying. And so, I searched for my model number and and replace keyboard, and boom, like I had 4 different options for people's videos of how to replace my keyboard on my model. I mean, they weren't even just this is how on some Dells you might. No, it was mine. It was my computer in the picture. It was amazing. I think they must have taken it at night, made the video, and given it back to me. So that particular question, how do you learn to use a cell phone, was asked of people in these countries. So these are different countries. Now, right, of course, within a country there's diversity of the way that people do things. Of course. That said, there are some shocking trends. So, ask a friend. That's what they do in India. If you're in India, that's how you learn to use something. Or at least more than half of you. Trial and error. Italy.
It's like the government. Yeah.
All right, we're not going to get too political here. All right, so who reads and tries? The Germans.
The Germans.
Oh, but we're not done with the Germans. So apparently, your manuals, your documentation had better be good when you send it to Germany. Because, look at that. So 90% of the Germans either read or read and try. So your documentation had better be fantastic when you send it to Germany. And nobody in China reads. Look, right? I mean, or at least they read and try. But they're not reading. So what's left, right? So in China, imitate is more popular, but asking the vendor. So your tech support in China had better be really good. Now, some of these are culturally created, right? So, for example, if you see, nobody in India asks a vendor. Well, maybe that's culturally created because maybe whoever provides tech support in India, even though India provides tech support for the rest of the world, right? Maybe in India, the tech support isn't good, for example. And so, in other words, they've learned not to bother doing that, and so culturally, that mode has been suppressed. Of course, those things are possible. But huge cultural differences in how people learn to do things. And of course, the same is true in the classroom. And if your classroom includes people from China, India, Italy, and Germany, right, and South Africa, and the United States, and any place else, right, you can't just pick one. You have to serve them all. So here's the nice thing, right? You don't just need to, it's not just about knowing who your students are. You get to decide who your students are. And so, right, either one works. So, right, Steve, is Steve hiding back there? Steve has left the room because he knows I'm going to pick on him. So yesterday, Steve changed his presentation on the fly. He was prepared to talk to you for a long time and then to bring you into a lab like this to practice. We walked in the morning, he saw we were already in a computer lab, he completely changed how he was planning to approach the day, and happily so. So he changed his presentation based on 2 things, right? The learning environment, and he also asked in the room who had experience with different things, so that he could think about how that would affect his presentation. So how can you find out? How can you adapt? How can you design for all possible students and all possible learning environments? right? So the good news is, right, you can decide. So this comes to the question of, right, who is this for? If you're designing a MOOC, who is it for? And the very decision of who is it for, that will narrow the scope of this overwhelming space. So if you decide, we're providing this particular, not remedial, but this particular, activity that's intended to excite students into applying to our campus, and we're targeting this rural high school where we have a local advocate, right? A local champion who will help us connect with those students, who will help create local community so that those students aren't isolated as they explore your materials. That really narrows the scope of what we are responsible for, right? Because now we have someone else to create the community for us in the remote location. As opposed to one student in this rural high school, one student in this other rural high school, one student someplace, in Soweto who, for some reason can't come over here. Maybe they're not even eligible to apply. You get to decide. You get to decide ahead of time on prerequisites. What is it that someone should know ahead of time? You can have a pre-test when people join your class so you actually know if they meet your prerequisites. And you can choose how you market your course. The good news is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The good news is the Open University in Europe, in the UK, right, has been doing this a lot. For years. It's just been called distance education, right? But the learning of what works in distance education is all still relevant here, and much more relevant than your experiences in your own classrooms. And so they've learned some things. They've learned things like that if you design courses appropriately and you put tutors in place and assessments in place that are, again, carefully designed, you can get people to complete these courses. They've had 1.6 million people complete courses that couldn't have met the requirements for entry to their universities. So, right, they are starting to reach the masses with that open university model. And not at the expense of quality. They're one of the highest ranked universities in Europe. They're in the top 10 with that model. And so, now it's not without some very careful experimentation and very careful design. So they've focused on multi-source learning. So some things just put on the television. BBC will just air some things and they'll just announce, here's this program, it's going to be on BBC, go ahead and watch it. But they'll also have not just virtual experiment kits, but physical experiment kits that they send out to people. And they do experiments and then they send it back. Right, that's a different way of engaging, right? They'll have online simulations, they'll have case studies, right? So there's no one way. And so it's through that multi-source learning that you reach different kinds of people and you find the ways that they get engaged. They recognize that interaction is important, and it is. It's crucially important. And by definition, right, especially if the M stands for massive, the interaction between you and your students, between an instructor and a student, has necessarily gone down, right? If you have 100,000 students, you will not have a personal relationship with all of them. I'm assuming. So what does that mean, right? Well, the lost interaction between you and the student has to be recovered somewhere. You need some other kind of interaction to make up for it. And the dream has always been, well, it will just be the interaction between the students and the materials. They'll just be self-driven, self-motivated learners, and I'm just getting in their way. They're going to learn really much faster if I just put the right materials in front of them. The interaction can be student material, but it can also be student-student. It can be student, some other remote peer advocate, right? I mean, someone at a local place that can make connections. It can be between other people in your instructional team, so not just you as the head instructor, right? But it can also be a variety of tutors and other kinds of professionals. Johnson and I were talking yesterday, like, in the future, it sounds like a career path will be professional discussion board moderator. Because if it takes, if you have a large MOOC and it takes 15 hours a week to moderate that discussion board, you're not going to do it. There's not enough of you to go around. So the interaction is important, but it doesn't have to come from you. Of course, the thing that Udacity found and that is at the heart of reaching the masses is that not all learners are ready to be self-motivated, independent learners. They don't have the skills to do it. And so, automated feedback can help, right? So if they do something and they get feedback that they're wrong and what's wrong and how to improve, and maybe it's hints at, right? But they need contact. Now Open University realizes just as much as you do that to have personal contact with 100,000 students is out of control. But you can have a little, and what they've found is that early is best. So if you early on give some attention to providing the more careful feedback to students, that they'll stay, and then when they stay, they'll learn how to engage in the other modes of interaction. But early on, it's really important for students to know that they're in the right place, that they're moving in the right direction. Even if it's, as Steve said, you're not giving feedback to all of them, but you're focusing on giving feedback to a few. To say, you're doing a really good job of posting, and to make that a public statement, then other students, they realize, oh, well, if I post a lot, then I will get that kind of feedback. Posting a lot is a good thing. And so it builds community. They discovered that assessment is as important as content, which is not surprising given the models we talked about earlier, right? And here's the part that's going to hurt for Johnson, right? So they discovered that an important member of a course design team is an instructional designer, a person who knows all about backwards design or constructive alignment, or about the various pedagogical slides that Steve skipped yesterday and that I'll dance through today, right? Because I'm also not going to focus on them because it's just too much. But an instructional designer is an expert in that stuff. You're an expert in your content. It works, right? Now suddenly you have what you never even had for your in-person class, right? You didn't have a course designer to help you do that. Maybe at best, Johnson was a nice colleague and shared some of his knowledge of that, or maybe Zach Simpson, right? So you have certain people who are local experts. Maybe you actually talk to those folks from education instead of treating them like outsiders. I'm looking at you. I mean, sometimes you do, right? And so you learn. You learn different ways of doing things, and you learn how to think differently about your material and the way you present it. So to have a person like that as a member of the team. Now, Johnson can't do it all. Zach can't do it all. And even your entire education faculty can't do it all if you really decided to deploy a lot of MOOCs. And I'm looking now here at people like you, right? If you want them to deploy a lot of MOOCs, it's going to take the resources, right? But those resources could be as simple as instead of taking the time for all of these people to become instructional design experts, it could mean just having a few people who are instructional design experts that partner on multiple courses. But we can't give it all to a couple of people. Yes?
May I just make another very non-academic comment here?
I'm sure you can.
I've been very interested in all this for the last 12 months. I worked myself into it. I looked a lot on the open internet. What can I find? The more serious YouTube stuff, and there are also platforms that sell their courses. They do those things. They do it intuitively. Yeah. It's not as structured as what we get it here now. But as you are going through the slide, I reflect on what I've seen. And I've seen it there already. The guys are far ahead with streetwiseness, what we are trying to do academically. You know what I mean? And I'm always astounded.
Right.
I've also got qualifications as long as my arm, and then I see stuff there that I never knew. And it is street level, but not to be discarded.
Because so I'll only disagree with one thing. You said they do it intuitively. They don't.
Somehow. I don't know.
No. They do it very intentionally by design.
That's why you pay for it.
Yeah. They know what they're doing, and it's very intentional. So it's not that they just sort of naturally were born knowing how to do it that way. Right there, I mean, when we design our class in the first year of engineering at Purdue, we talk every time we talk about making changes to the course. We talk about, you know, what are the things that motivate students, and I tend to fall back on the what's called self-determination theory: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So we need to make sure students always feel like they can do what we ask them to do. They need to know that they have the authority to have some choice in the matter. And the things we do need to build community. We need to create a learning environment that promotes students interacting with one another. But it's all very intentional. The students don't know that we do this, right? But we do.
But my point was really, we should all look there too.
Oh, absolutely.
Not on the fluffy stuff that is, you know, but there are some really serious guys out there that are doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think I'm experiencing like a big gap. I mean, you know, my generation, a lot of studying was really an individual activity, 80% maybe, and then 20% kind of group stuff. But the base of it was you going and reading. And is that whole model been overturned? Because it seems like everything we're hearing about is around community and kind of, you know, peer engagement and whatever, and I'm missing this piece where you just go to the library and read and take notes and do problems.
And I'm actually going to let Steve in a second. I'm going to let you chime in as a publisher about, you know, where the book market is, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think the nature of learning has changed. I think it has always been. I will throw out the term socio-constructivist, right? I think knowledge has always been socially constructed. The difference is, when the more limited access was to education, right, and even in our own lifetimes, right, that has shifted dramatically, right? They had to, in the United States, they had to recenter, they had to recalibrate the SAT, the primary college admissions test, not because students had gotten dumber, but because so many more students were going to college that the average changed, right? So when access was more restricted, you learned a lot more from a book, and then the social construction happened after that. When classes were smaller, you tended to have that engagement with the people after you had done the reading. But now, right, when social media have connected, I mean, my son, who is 16 years old, has been for maybe 7 years, has been communicating with a student from Korea who left his school and went back to Korea with his family. And when they play video games, they're talking to people from around the world. And I mean, their world is entirely different, right? So they tend to start from social interaction. And the hope, right, is as they become independent learners, we'll get them to pick up the books. It would be fantastic, and it would make the publishers happy too. So if you would, Steve, for a moment, just talk about how has the publishing industry changed?
Unfortunately, not enough. Textbook publishing is a conservative business, and so they're slow to adapt to the new technologies, the new way of doing things, and unfortunately, that's why there are so few textbook publishers left anymore. They're kind of all folding into one massive corporation. And we've seen, particularly in the United States, which my closest area of expertise, a devaluation of the textbook in general. A student buys a textbook because the professor says you have to, not because they're seeing the intrinsic value in it. It's part of the requirements for the course. Textbook publishers could do a lot better job in making 21st century textbooks, but they're not.
How many of you still have the books that you purchased when you were a student?
Some of them.
Some of us.
Right, some of them. Yeah, well, not all, right. What would the answer be if I asked my students today?
Virtually none. Except
Virtually none.
Some of the none of the introductory courses. Some of the very specialized courses where this is going to be part and parcel of what they're doing for a living. They'll keep those books. Plus, you don't get as much to sell those back. So.
That's right. Maybe that's the more determining factor. So MOOCs also represent a research opportunity, and I'm almost done with my remarks, and we'll have even more open question time. So Johnson, later, will talk about scholarship of teaching and learning in a MOOC environment. Right, so those research opportunities are interesting, right? There are some research opportunities on how is learning in a MOOC the same or different from learning in other environments. And there's not been enough of that. There's been a lot more research on who actually participates in MOOCs, because you see me throw a lot of data out about that, right? And even some research on what happens to those different types of participants, right? So which ones finish, which ones engage with different kinds of materials, and so forth. But those are important questions, because the more you learn about your students, again, you learn how to design a MOOC so that it reaches all of them. You got some colleagues right here in South Africa. This is at University of Cape Town. Chernevich and her colleagues, they describe not different types of MOOC participants, they describe different types of MOOCs. And so this could really help you think about what is your objective as you produce a MOOC. And the 5 types, and again I have the paper for this, there's the teaching showcase, right? And this, like the early Harvard ones, right? Or you mentioned Columbia, I think it was. We would like to capture this gifted professor for all time, the teaching showcase. On the other hand, right, gateway skills. We're going to take the people in some of the rural areas, maybe their high schools don't offer all the courses that we wish, and we're going to help them be prepared to enter the university environment. There are graduate skills, right? The things you didn't get to teach in your courses, but they're important and students need them to be best prepared for the workforce. Professional skills. Long out from graduation, they're trying to continue their professional development, right? Very different population, very different objectives. And then finally, some of the MOOCs that are out there are not the teaching showcase, it's the research showcase, right? Let me show you the cool research that's going on in this laboratory. It can be used to recruit graduate students, but if it's done properly, it could be used also simultaneously to get undergraduate students excited about going to graduate school. It could do both, right? So again, I have that paper. I don't have a link to it, unfortunately. So here are the slides that Steve skipped yesterday, and I'm mostly going to address these by their titles. That is a really intimidating slide. Don't even attempt to read it. The whole point of that slide is that learning theory, the learning theory space is massive and diverse, and I mean it looks at it from so many different perspectives, and it's intimidating. That's it. That's why that slide is designed. It's designed to be intimidating. Thank you, edX, for making that absolutely clear. And the point is, you can't possibly be an expert in all of those things. Right? That's why we need, why I even let you see this slide, right? So yes, it's intimidating, but if you find a few things in there that you can connect with, right, that you can make your classes better. So the edX folks focus on sort of a 4-part strategy. Thinking about making learning active. Hugely important. There are people who are experts in the MOOC space, and it's not just enough to say that social connectivity is important in a MOOC. It's the only thing, according to people that do this a lot. It's the whole thing that holds it together, is by creating community in the students. Mastery learning, which is both sort of the certification processes that Steve talked about, but also having checkpoints along the way to assure that students are keeping up. And then universal design, which is much more of what I've been talking about, having some kind of overarching theory of how you're designing a learning experience. And so, again, I'm not going to spend time on these. Active learning is anything that gets students to do something other than just to sit and listen. And there are lots of different ways to get students to be active, and you just have to find ones that work for you. There are structures of stages of learning. The one that's shown here is called Bloom's taxonomy. There are others. There are others that are even more respected in the die-hard education community. But the point being, all of these provide a framework for thinking about making sure you provide students experiences that are at different levels of learning. So they just help you think about what experiences you're providing. There's theory behind the social networking, social learning stuff, and so there are some references there for you to think about and to think about how those fit for you. And then finally, this particular approach, universal design, actually thinks about the way that the brain works and about providing things that connect to different parts of the human brain. So again, I'll give you the slides. You can look at them in greater detail. All of those come from edX, so Steve might even have more information from the edX people about those. But again, for reference, right? I need to make sure I acknowledge it's so. In addition to Jennifer DeBoer, who is absolutely fabulous, and some of the research on the edX stuff that you've seen is hers. Particularly the multinational things that she's done. The committee that I work for with IEEE, which is how I got myself into this mess, is the Curricula and Pedagogy Committee, and that the members are shown. The University Resources Committee have provided staff support to this entire committee as it's done its work. And we have the support and encouragement of the IEEE Educational Activities Board, of which Saurabh Sinha is the chair. Some of the slides you've seen were shared directly from the MIT Learning Laboratory. Lori Breslow is the director, and so, but Jennifer, of course, reached out to her for some of the material. And then, of course, the edX folks for the whirlwind slides on pedagogy and learning. So, so the talk is not anything of my own creation entirely. We have more time for questions. I think at least 10 minutes more for questions, I think, on agenda. Yes?
Are assessments done in a controlled environment to avoid cheating?
Yeah, so I see talked some about in the, if you wanted the, what was the term, the verified certificate, right? Then that requires, and this in and of itself costs money. So when edX or anyone else charges money for a verified certificate, part of that cost is the cost of verifying identity. It's not just, well, now that you want something out of it, we can charge you, right? That's part of it, right? But a big part of it though is it costs money to know that you're you. So because you have to use the technology that will take a picture of some kind of government ID and then look at your face and confirm. The same thing that might happen face to face if you were being very diligent in administering an examination.
The 3 generations of activity theory. It's Vygotskian based, so one cannot avoid using that as well, because it includes cultural artifacts, it includes learning artifacts, environmental situations. So that's a lovely theory to have a look at. Engerstrom,
Excellent.
Swedish educational researcher, and then the authentic learning capability, which comes in with the holistic design and universal design, of course. And another thing is we could also not get away from Siemens's connectivism theory. I know they're all underlying in
Right, yeah, that's definitely among the underlying theories of the social network theory.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and social constructivism.
Right, social constructivism.
The other thing also is, even though we've read a book in the library, you cannot avoid to go out and say to someone, listen, I've just read about this and this. What did you read on? And that's still collaboration. So it's behavioristic, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. No, and I mean, obviously you would be one of the people who will help the other faculty
Yeah.
make those connections.
Yeah, I haven't got a choice.
Excellent. Other comments, questions? Yes.
Yes. One of the main purpose of this workshop is to be able to develop ourselves, with respect to the scholarship of teaching and learning. I know that you've got a lot of experience with respect to that. What would be your advice, to a group like us who are just starting? What are the major areas that we must look at to be able to develop ourselves into probably a very good group in the scholarship of teaching and learning?
So I know that Johnson's going to talk a lot more about that. I will preface his remarks, and I will say just a couple of things. So first, do no harm. I know that Johnson is going to spend some time talking to you about the ethics of research when humans are involved. Right? Many of you probably do research where you're allowed to break something to find out how it works. You're not allowed to break your students to find out how they learn. Right? So the entire paradigm of what it means to measure is different from what we are used to, right, in most of engineering work. So listen to Johnson when he talks to you about those things. The other is, I guess one other piece of advice would be take the time to, once you've decided on a particular question that you have from a research perspective, take the time to find out what other people have done, right? So it's easy to assume, just because MOOCs are new and you're new to this area, it's easy to assume that the things that you're interested in asking questions about haven't been studied before. But they probably have, and there's probably related research that you can learn from and, at the very least, inform the work that you do, instead of, starting off on a whole new thing. Because of the fact that we can't break students, most of what are called experimental approaches are not even an option for us, right? We can't randomly assign students to classes. We can't randomly assign most educational experiences, right? So the idea of sort of randomized controlled trials, it just doesn't work. So again, Johnson will talk more about the kinds of methods that get used when you do research in this space. So, thanks for sharing your slides with me, Johnson. Sure, Steve, and I know you had another comment.
Just to follow up a little bit on what you said about experimenting. Within the edX platform itself, there is some room for experimenting with different methods. We talked about cohorts, dividing students into different groups. If you want to try out something different, without exposing everybody in the group, again, something you think will work, but you can put a certain set of the students in there and see how they perform versus the other students in there. So there is that ability built into the platform to play around with things. Again, do no harm, but if you want to try out something new, that's a way of doing it.
Nice. And
Yeah. I just want to ask, what is the degree of penetration, let's say for public schools and university? What percentage do you think in the future will be based on MOOCs rather than traditional classrooms and that type of thing?
wow, okay. So fortunately I get to guess, because by the time this comes true, I won't be here anymore. So I can tell you this. So in my role with IEEE, we did a survey of engineering faculty. It was really focused on the faculty and the administrators at academic institutions. And we asked the question, how many of you have given credit for incorporated MOOCs into your curriculum in the past 5 years? And the answer was, virtually none. How many, then the same question, right, but looking into the future, how many of you expect to have some or all of your curriculum delivered through that mode in the next 5 years? And the answer was 35%. So a recent study actually came out, the Harvard MIT people with edX, just 2 days ago, a finding which is the growth of MOOCs and related things, it's not exponential. And so now it's on a slow growth. I expect that most universities will have a few offerings that are common and offered, and count. Introductory coursework, remedial coursework, particularly promotional materials of different kinds, whether it's research showcase or teaching showcase, right? But, come to this university and you can experience this exciting professor, this exciting research area, right? So I think those will be very common. And the other place I think the market will grow dramatically are on the professional development side. The courses that very few people have access to, but they are professionals and they are ready to pay and they want quality, right? So I am working in a nuclear power plant and I need to learn how to monitor the condition of my fuel rods, right? Right? I mean, there are not very many schools that can teach that. So, but those people will pay because it's holding them back professionally if they can't move into certain parts of the nuclear power plant. I think that market will grow dramatically. I think we're right on schedule.
I'm sure that there are occasional academic development seminars that might touch on this sort of thing, but it's such a broad topic and such a diverse topic that it's not worth trying to learn about all of it, really. It's more about learning about where you want to fit into it.
Yeah, and then the other thing, it seems, and again, I'm speaking of kind of the engineers, this desire to infer cause and effect, and we tend to do a lot of correlation studies and make causal inferences which do not exist. I mean, how do you keep people from doing this? I mean,
what I personally do is I attack their experiment, whatever it was, and say, oh really? And you think that this was a good measure of student engagement? Or
no, not the measure, but the cause and effect relationship inferred from a correlation is problematic. I mean,
yes. Matt is standing up, so I think that he wants to jump in.
Oh, well, I mean, I usually cover it by example. So, for example, so math ability is correlated with height. As it turns out, math ability is correlated with age, and age is correlated with height. Right? You learn more math as you go through school. So, but math ability is not really correlated with height.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, most of the causational fallacies, right, are because there's some mediating thing which is related to both.
Well, the one that we were infected with was the correlation between student performance and class performance. So you get students who attend the class more do better. So get students to come to class.
So force them to attend class.
Exactly.
And it will magically improve their performance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I actually have a more sarcastic example.
Go.
If you've seen, you can find this online. It has to do with the flying spaghetti monster. But the global warming is strongly correlated, or rather inversely correlated, with the number of pirates in the world. Because there are far fewer pirates than there used to be, and global warming is going up and up and up. So let us rather have more pirates, and perhaps this global warming thing will be sorted.
Just to manage a little bit of digression, in response to Dr. Kubate's question, what I do in my research, I also try to look at the analysis too. I look at in terms of, I use structural equation modeling, which actually give me a more correlative effect compared to the correlation. So if I use XCM, depending on the tool you're using, it actually gives you a better fit statistics with other parameters that will actually tell you if this relates to this. It's not exploratory, it's confirmatory. So that actually tells you if what you study actually have a resemblance. Then I also look at the structure, the variance readings in terms of is this item actually measuring this? Then that also helps for you to know if they actually relate. That's what I do.
Which is a good engineering answer.
Yeah.
And a more open answer in a way would be, and it is building on, Matt's talking about things correlated, but that doesn't mean causal, is to say, well, it looks like, there's a correlation between class attendance and performance. Let's sit down with some students and ask them why they're attending classes and whether they think it helps with their performance. And then maybe that will tell us whether this is actually a relationship or not. But it might be that the students who attend class have cars and are therefore something and are therefore so.
Or what is it that you think your grades predict? I know a professor who wanted to understand how students were learning strength of materials, and so he interviewed students who did fabulously on his exams, and he asked students who had on the test consistently said yes, for the same amount of material you want, you would like it to be in the configuration of a pipe rather than a solid rod, because that makes it stronger, stiffer, right? And so he asked students, why is that the case? And consistently the answer was, because you told us it was, but I know you're wrong. So their conceptual understanding was in a completely different place from their responses on the exam. They know rod, it's solid. If it's solid, of course it's stronger. And but they knew what the answer was on the test, and they gave it to them. Right? So what is it that your exams reflect? I don't mean to disillusion you about your test making process.
It's actually important to think about, especially in the context of online assessment. What is it that your online assessment is assessing? I'll come back to that. So I'm going to run through at some speed some of the things that you have already seen that on edX that can be used to enable research. So first of all, there are the classical assessment things that you all had to set up one of them either this morning or yesterday afternoon, that how you would build an online test. And any one of these things could become part of a research project, whether it's how do students do answering this question. You could do this literally as a survey. How did this test go in your own opinion? Then edX also has opportunity for some very complex things that, again, depending on your field, if you're working in microbiology, you might be able to extract a lot of information about what students are doing and how they're thinking through the protein builder tool that I've never seen, but apparently you can build proteins. Then there's also some decidedly more complex things that you can do. Essentially anything that you can write in JavaScript or put in an iframe can be done on edX. Anything that you can write in Python can be uploaded on edX. As I said, that can become as complicated as you or your programming assistant's abilities will allow. You can also do, somehow, I haven't done it, but external grading systems. So you can have edX give you all of the student responses or results, process them however you want to, and then upload the results. Or in the context of research, download all of the responses, and then do perhaps discourse analysis or narrative analysis on the thing to see what are the things going on as students respond. There's also the ability within edX to do what they call conditional modules, where as the result of something the student does comes about, you can then send them on a different pathway through the material. So, and again, I haven't done it, but things like if you missed question 2, then you get routed through revision of chapter 3. If you got question 2 right, then no problems, carry on. Or probably you could even do such things as, did you watch the video to the end? If so, then carry on this way. Or if you didn't, then let's ask you some follow-up questions about why you stopped watching. They also have what they call content experiments, where you literally have some students get path A, some students get path B. And this could be based on a variety of things. You can, edX will assign students randomly into this, or you can set up groups to say, let's send this group this way, this group that way. Just keep in mind, this could be handy if you were doing a MOOC that forms part of your UJ class as well. You could use this to keep all of your UJ people doing one particular thing, while everyone else may not need to come and write down the code that you said out loud in Wednesday class.
That's a useful strategy for surveys too. So if you want to survey for a large enough group, right? You'd like to survey something about this thing about the experience, this thing about the experience, this thing about the experience. Well, I mean, if you've got enough students, especially, right? This 1,000 students, see this set of survey questions. This other set of 1,000 students see a different set of survey questions. So they don't all have to answer all of them, right? You can save a lot of grief, but you still have plenty of data to know what's going on.
And there are probably studies about how many questions in an online survey is optimal. I don't know what the answer is, but for me, if it's more than 10 questions, I give up. You can also divide the class into cohorts that then can be assigned different things. And this can be done, again, according to random distribution or this particular decisions thing, or you can do it manually. So these people are in one cohort, and each cohort will only see the other people in their cohort. So if you have a MOOC with 50,000 students, you might think actually groups of 1,000 would be better. We don't want everyone making a giant discussion board where it's going to be a mess. Split them into cohorts, and then this cohort will have their discussion board, that cohort will have their discussion board. These sorts of things you can already see, and I'm seeing a few engineering wheels turning about, oh yes, we'll do this with these students, are ethically dubious. Because which students are you putting in which group, and is that hurting them? Which group is did they get to choose which group they're in? So don't just go out and do this. UJ and your faculty has an ethics committee that thinks about these sorts of things. edX themselves are sorting out the ethics of these sorts of things. I don't know what the outcome was, but last year Harvard convened a panel of, I think it was like 50 faculty members, just to look at the ethics of what they're looking at on edX. So I said, don't do this casually. It's easy to set up, but that doesn't mean that it's right. As Matt said, do no harm. And incidentally, I am not the right person to ask whether something is ethically good. I can discuss, but there's a committee for that. So I said, follow your own faculty's processes, ask your superiors. Another great thing about edX, and a terrifying thing, is that the edX platform is watching everything. And everything is captured and collected and then given to a data czar. That if UJ was joining as a full-on edX member, one of the things would be we'd have to find a person to be the data czar who would manage this copious amount of data that edX can provide. The data that they gather is all of the information about students and how they're progressing through your class. So have they done the test, how did they do on the test, those sorts of things. Also, the discussion forum data, how are the discussions evolving, all of the, this post at this time, this post at this time. The classes have wikis associated with, that again, it's keeping track not just of here's the wiki at the end, but who corrected it when, what did they say, what was there before. Again, handy in case you have a student go on a rampage and delete the whole thing. Somewhere it is being saved. And then edX is also recording student and instructor event data, which essentially means that anytime something happens, edX takes a note. So, and I will momentarily justify the existence of a data czar. Here's an example of an event that edX recorded. And you can see that it took me a while to step through this, but this is an event in the module edX AN101 2014 term 1 with user ID 9999999. It was anonymized. That wasn't actually their user ID. And their username at the bottom, AAA. So this student was doing a multiple choice questions thing at 6:19 UTC on the 3rd of March last year. And one of the questions was, what color is the ocean on a sunny day? And they put yellow and it was wrong. This is why it was anonymized, I think. And then the other question was, which of the following are musical instruments? And they said a piano and guitar, and that one was right. This is a problem check event. Useful, right? Here are some other examples of events that edX is keeping track of. And here's some more, and here's some more. Some interesting ones are, did you just add somebody to the class or not? They keep track of that, so don't think you can, oh, let's add the student at the last minute. Did you pause the video? How long did you pause it for, and when did you push play again? Was the window that the video was in open, or are you watching the closed captioning? Did you just turn the page in the textbook? How long did you spend on that page? edX knows all of this. But the data czar, you need someone who is technically capable of extracting only the information that you actually want to see. Because if you want to know how long students spent on a test, you don't want to filter through all of the times they turned the page in the textbook. So lots of data available. Again, is it ethical? And this is not quite as obviously dubious, but is it actually right to notice when students are reading the textbook and when they're not?
One point on the ethics. Most of the data that's accessible to the individual institutions within edX, including IEEE, is anonymized.
Yes, absolutely.
So you can gather all that. I imagine edX could probably figure out who that actual person is, but IEEE as an edX institution cannot.
Sure.
Get basic profile data.
Good. That makes good sense.
Yeah.
But still, if you find out a week before the course is over that none of your students have been reading the textbook, you might treat the students differently all of a sudden, and you might decide to change the test at the end. Is that ethical? It's debatable. Again, there are committees for this. So,
Sorry, that's a question.
oh, you have a question, sorry?
Yeah, it was partly to do with what you answered with anonymous, because I was going to say we have the POPI Act here. Does that filter in here? Because we're not allowed to give out student information.
It will somehow, but I don't know exactly how. I suspect, don't quote me on this, but I suspect that edX's policies will probably cover POPI Act. But I'm not entirely sure.
I'm sure we'll soon find out if we
Yes.
The other thing is, you're saying that if UJ joined edX, so this is, an individual can just go and use this, am I right?
Steve will correct me if I misspeak. That UJ could join edX as an institution, which would be expensive and we're not likely to do. The most likely way forward is that IEEE has joined edX, and UJ will quasi-join edX through IEEE.
That's the arrangement we're discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also possible that neither of those things will happen and we will do something else entirely, or, you never know, we may abandon edX entirely. But these are things to keep in mind, whatever platform. Sorry, Jane, go ahead.
Can I
Yeah.
just ask Steve, is it essential that the university joins one of these?
Well, if
When you do it on your own, you just do it.
you can do it on your own and just do it. edX, the edX platform is open source. You can download Open edX and have it hosted on your own systems. You're not going to get that worldwide audience probably that is otherwise. But if you want to do private courses for your university, open it to the public. How much promotion you do to bring people in would be up to you. So you may not have 160 countries and 10,000 or 15,000 students, but that may be okay. That may be what you want. It's just a decision point on how you want to move forward and what kind of global impact you're looking for.
Wait, one of the things we were just discussing before this, Arno and I a bit, was what steps we should take to see whether a local implementation is feasible enough that we can do it very, very quickly while the rest is going on. Because if so, then we could develop content now and then later upload it to the grant system after we've tested it a little bit on ourselves.
As long as Anna knows it.
So coming back to research, given this very broad realm of ways to ask questions, and given this very large amount of data that is potentially available through edX, and that's not even covering the things that are, you could go out and find not directly through edX. If necessary, you could find students enrolled in your MOOC to interview in person. There would be funding and things, but you could do that. So how do you start? And I like to say, start with the question, and then me personally, how would you answer the question if you just wanted to know for yourself? So, how are my students learning? That's probably too broad. So, okay, so how are the video tutorials that I just came up with, how are they affecting student learning? That might still be too broad. All right, so how is it affecting student learning about the concept of oscillation? So I've got these tutorials about oscillation. How is it affecting student learning? Does this seem like a reasonable question? Yes? This sort of thing that you just spent hours making these tutorials. Was it a good idea? How is it changing things? So you could do the classical engineering thing is, do these videos help students pass my test about oscillation? These just sort of have to figure out which students watched the videos and how did they do, and is there a nice correlation there? You could say, well, how do the students' perceptions about oscillation change when watching the video tutorials? Or can we take all of this, some large body of data from a MOOC, and somehow tag it such that we can see the effect that video tutorials might have had on some other type of information? So, did the students contribute to the discussion board after they watched the videos, or before they watched the videos and then they abandoned the discussion board? You could look for those sorts of things in a starting with the data and then extracting the patterns way. Or thinking of the discourse theory, how does the maturity of students' discussion posts change before and after they watch the videos? So you could go through the discussion board and say, here's a student being an idiot about oscillation, and then here's a student who said something that was right. Here's a student using the word oscillation perfectly, and then see whether they watched videos before or after that, and so you could infer a possible effect. So for any particular research question then, you have to say which framework is most important, is most appropriate, both for my question, whether it's something that's very much an experiment, that this is something that we will test and have strong data that correlates sort of thing. Also for your background. I mean, just because I said that it's possible doesn't mean that you should all go out and try to write social constructivist papers. And also for where you think you might want to publish this. Or even if you're not thinking about publish this, who are you going to be defending this to? Because if this is going into an engineering journal, not an engineering education, but an engineering journal, and you come with interpretivist and grounded theory phenomenology, they're going to throw it back at you. So I said, don't jump into something thinking, oh, of course, we'll do it this way, and Johnson said so. Look, where is this going, and who are you taking this case to? The counterpoint of that, if you try to publish something that is set up like a classical scientific experiment in an education journal, it can happen, but you will struggle. You will need quite a bit of defense about why this was a good way to approach whatever question you have. So within that framework, which methodology makes the best case? So, you shouldn't just choose discourse analysis because you've got all of the data. The methodology that you choose should be the thing that will convince people that your research was a good thing to do, and was a good question to ask, and you answered it, and you approached the question the right way. And then finally, the method. What data are you going to need? How are you going to get it? Is it feasible? If it involves interviewing students on 6 continents, that's not going to work, and you should back up a step and find something else. So keep in mind, though, looking at this large amount of data, large realm of ways of doing things, start with your question and then see what makes sense. Don't start with, wow, look at all this data, what can we say about it? I skipped a few things on purpose, such as qualitative versus quantitative. Partly because with in some cases, some real forcing a square peg into a round hole. Qualitative and quantitative could be applied to any of the methodologies that I talked about. You can take a discussion board analysis and go through and tag where people are doing certain things, as in the grounded theory approach, and then the end result can be quantitative. You can say 13% of students did it like this, 12% of students did it like this. Or you can make it much more qualitative, where you say, this is how it seemed to evolve, this is the way that, this is the patterns that we seem to notice, and describe in more detail what seems to be going on. So it's almost an orthogonal axis that you could do a bit, either way. Like I said, there's some forcing. It's hard to construct a phenomenography study that's positivist and based on survey data, sort of thing. But in very rough theory possible. Also, generalizability. You'd answer a research question in your context with your students. How much should people expect that to apply to their context and their students? Again, it depends very much on what you're doing, and you need to think about that in terms of how it will work. I mean, the thing about the length of videos in lectures in MOOCs took this large amount of data and did nice little graphs and said, look, and here's where the graph falls off. So don't make a video longer than 6 minutes. But that might not actually be true for you and your class. It's just a good general rule. And then mixed methods. In this case, thinking mixed methods, mixing almost any of the things that I've talked about is again possible if it supports your research question and defends the way that you are trying to answer it. In the middle there, you can see the International Journal of Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning, which I mentioned earlier. You could also look at education-focused avenues of publication. So here are some examples of some fairly highly rated education journals that would possibly need a slightly different context, but this fits into their domain. You can also look at field-specific education-focused journals. So, and this is engineering-specific, sorry, not engineers. But chemical engineering has a journal of chemical engineering education. If you were going to publish there, keep in mind, you wouldn't want to come to this journal that is read by chemical engineers with a phenomenography study about how students, those engineers are going to expect something a little more quantitative probably. It's also possible and sometimes beneficial to publish in a non-education focused, field-specific sort of journal. I said here, and I'm glad that someone else mentioned these in the last couple of days, research in engineering design and design studies are interested in anything that has to do with design, including learning about design or teaching design. What does it mean to become a designer? They also do architectural design and things about how how studies should be designed. Like I said, in almost anything with the word design in it, they might be interested in. IEEE Transactions on Power Systems has published things about how to teach power systems. And in a way, depending on who you want to reach, if your class is about power systems, maybe you care more about reaching other people who are interested in power systems than you care about reaching other people who are interested in how to teach. So lots of places that this could be published. Say there, I can't remember what it was. That's the end. At the end, I've got references for all the things I talked about specifically.
I'll just add that in the you worry about maybe certain methods reaching an engineering audience, right? Once upon a time, the Journal of Engineering Education, the predominant research in that journal was quantitative, positivistic in some way, right? As engineering education has become more established and these other methods have become more established within our domain, a variety of things have changed. One, it's easier to get a paper accepted that has those other methods, right? But more to the point, a variety of other things have changed. The average length of a paper has changed because it takes more words to talk about a phenomenographical study than it does to throw up a few graphs and say, look, it drops off after 6 minutes, right? They've shifted actually their style of citation, because qualitative research and people who do research in that way tend more to want to know who the human beings are who are involved in the research. So they've shifted to an APA style so that you see the names of the authors in the text, which was not the way previously. So a variety of shifts have taken place as those methods have become recognized as valid research methods in that space. The transition is a slow one. So if it's IEEE transactions on power systems, you probably want to hold off on the phenomenographical study. But in some of the others, it's there, and the reviewers, the editors, and the readers are ready to think that way.
The one you notice my top citation there is Emerging Research Methodologies in Engineering Education Research from 2011 in the Journal of Engineering Education, that was basically describing that list of methodologies that I had and how one goes about using them, and arguing that the engineering education community needs to be looking at these a lot more and respecting them a lot more. And incidentally, that paper was by Jenny Case, who's at UCT. Any other questions?
Are you finding the research, is there still a lot of pressure that the research in engineering education or in MOOCs, whatever, must be kind of immediately applicable? Because it seems like, institutionally, there's an expectation that I'm going to read something so I can now go and do something in my class. How is that evolving in terms of the expectation?
I haven't seen that. Reading things, no one that I have seen sort of says, well, okay, with the exception of something with stupendous amounts of data and in a specific context like MOOCs, they said sort of conclusively, don't make your videos longer than 6 minutes. But other than something sort of very situational like that, I haven't seen anyone who is saying, and this is the way you should do it. It tends to be, so I haven't found papers where you would conclude with, oh, I've learned something and now I'm going to do it. It would be, I've found a good idea that this person showed was a good idea over there. Let's find out if it's a good idea over here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that people are accessing this literature to figure out an immediate problem, generally speaking, or,
So I'll put it this way, and this is a general observation about the way research happens in technical fields. So the first research that happens is what is called efficacy, right? Does it work? Is it reproducible, right? So does it produce a positive outcome? The second generation of work is effectiveness. Is this approach better than what we already do? Let's compare it to other things in some way that it's believable that it makes sense to do it this way, especially if there's an additional cost. The research that's more philosophical, organizational, like trying to, even taxonomical, right? So trying to understand the space. Epistemological research, research of trying to understand the nature of the thing comes later. When, it's probably not the right way, right? And the research on the ethics of doing some of the things that are happening in MOOCs, like that's also one of the things that comes later, right? It's like, wow, we can do stem cell research. That probably has some ethical implications. We'll worry about those later, right? Let's find out what we can do first, then we'll worry about whether or not we should. Oh my God, right? So yes, you're right. The application, it's part of the nature of particularly the engineering community, right? We want to know how to do something, and then we'll take a step back and think about the nature of the thing and its properties.
So it's evolving.
And sort of related to that, engineers very much want there to be a right answer. That
But there is a right answer.
but there is a right answer. So keep in mind, epistemology. There is a right answer for you in your context. But just because you're good, you brought an iPad into your class and have done amazing things, has nothing to do with how that's going to go down in my class. So it's most of the researchers don't make sweeping generalizations about what should be done that often.
Well, one of my most painful experiences in terms of this, at the first SASE conference, we had kind of the educationalist people and the engineers. And somebody presented something, and I think it was, what is the epistemology of engineering? And you can see the engineers are sitting there like, what, you know? Yeah. And it, you know, and I think it, you know, you can see there was a whole different.
Whereas, you know, at Purdue now, right? This is so.
Around it,
we managed to make a space at Purdue where we have enough people doing this kind of work. Our department head started his career at Purdue as the epistemology professor of engineering education.
Oh wow.
Who ended up, you know, when that title was conferred upon him, sitting next to the president of the university, right? And the president said, I think it's kind of cool that we can have an epistemology professor of engineering education.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, it just sounded so unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the engineers all ran away.
Oh, I mean, I think most of our engineering colleagues don't even have any idea what that means,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
That he has that.
I think they wear a hat, like bishops.
Or a blindfold.
Robert, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to know how much of this research is actually implemented on a large scale or permanently.
Okay? So your qualification changes the outcome. How much of it is implemented? If you look at how these sorts of research things are done, sort of all of it by the people who are doing it. On a large scale, it depends on who's making the decision. Because the people who are making large scale or permanent decisions change. That tends to become sort of a more social, political question because things are not universally applicable. As I said, the thing that works amazingly for you and for the entire chemical engineering department may be a terrible idea in the electrical engineering department. So somewhere there has to be someone, the people deciding don't look and say, oh look, here's the answer. They look and say, we think there might be a problem. What are some ways that we can do this? And in an ideal world, they would simultaneously study how it worked in their context to then follow up with your study about how it worked in your context. So, as this is not, very rarely will any of this be things that will change the world in one fell swoop, that this is the right way to do it.
I mean, it follows the standard rules of technology transfer. If it's an easy change to make, you should probably keep your videos to 6 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Yeah, cool. Right? I could do that. If it's, some of the more, the deeper questions, right, of you should probably think about learning some new research methods. Right? Or you should probably, incorporate, have a collaborator who is an instructional design specialist. Oh, I got to work with someone else who thinks differently than I do? Oh God. No offense. I'm sure you're a nice guy.
I mean, I'm trying to think sort of all of the things I've read, if I can think of anything that was sort of universally applicable. And the only example I can think of is in elementary school education when you're adding two numbers, like 10 plus 7. There's sort of two ways to do it, and I'm going to misquote this, but it's sort of you can start with the first number and then add up to add the second number on top, or you can somehow add the next larger factor of 10 and then subtract down. So you can do 10 plus 7 is 20 minus 3 to get back down to 7 is 17. And in Japan, they did studies and proved that for elementary school students, there was a particular number combination that was equally good both ways. So if you try to explain two methods with 10 and 7, it's going to be no good because you're going to do the one method that works really well for 10 and 7. You're not even going to think about the other. But if you use 9 and 11, or 9 and 13 or something, there's a particular combination that it's the same number of steps both ways, so you can teach the one way and then teach the other way and then talk about how they're different. And so the article I was reading was this Japanese education, I think it was not a minister, but someone who's organizing curriculums, who came to visit the US, where a lot of this research originated, and was astonished that no one was actually doing it. That they're like, but this is the best way to do it, why aren't you doing it? But that comes up very rarely. Rarely is it so generally applicable that it's the right answer for everyone.